Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Kostas Kampourakis. He is author and editor of several books about science. He works at the Teacher Training Institute and the section of Biologie at the University of Geneva. And today we're talking about his book, Darwin Mythology, Debunking Myths, Correcting Falsehoods. So, Dr. Kampourakis, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me too.
Okay, so let me start by asking you, I guess, a simple question. So, what is the premise of the book, and why did you feel the need to write a book, such a volume on Darwin and myths surrounding Darwin?
Yeah. Well, Darwin is perhaps the most well-known naturalist of all time. And even though there are so many books about him, there also exist numerous myths. And whereas I had seen them being debunked in one book or another, I thought that it would be useful to have a collection with all the myths debunked in one place. And as you know, this is not a book I wrote because I don't think that any single person could have written this book, because the scholarship and the available material on Darwin is enormous. That's why I'm glad that I managed to bring together a group of stellar historians, each one of whom took the task to debunk a specific myth. And here we are with this collection.
So, of course, Darwin is considered a very big figure. The biggest figure in biology, in evolutionary biology, and so on, in naturalism more generally. And he is considered, of course, a hero by many people. So, what would you say are the problems with hero worshipping in science and other disciplines?
Yeah, I think this is a big issue, and this is actually the topic of another book I have written about Mendel, because Mendel, Darwin, and other people are important in what they did, but they were never alone. All of them always relied on predecessors or contemporaries, people who did similar work. And of course, there is something to be important about them. There are features that distinguish them from others, but it was never the case that they did what they did on their own. They always received feedback, material, information, views from other people. They relied on the predecessors, they worked with contemporaries, and therefore, hero worshipping masks the important fact that science is always done by communities. Even though we may have some brilliant individuals who managed to bring together the key ideas, it was never them alone who came up with these ideas.
Mm-hmm. And in regards to hero worshipping and these sort of simplistic narratives that many times we hear about the lives of scientists and other intellectuals, why do you think that people tend to like them so much?
Well, we like them because it is easy to think that a single genius individual who is far away from what we, normal people are, came up with this brilliant idea. I think we like heroes. That's why mythology was something that people always liked. That's why people watch films with heroes. And it's also a very simple explanation that, that someone brilliant found this and we're done. However, I repeat, this is not how science is done. And this is actually something that makes science seem distant to people. Whereas all those individuals, they were brilliant, but they were also ordinary people with ordinary lives. So there's no need to make this seem very, very different from what regular people are. People like heroes for many reasons. There is also the fact that textbooks and school materials perpetuate these images, with these historical vignettes they usually have about the lives of these people. And I must note, I don't want to mean that these people were not important. They were important, but they always worked in a specific context, scientific and social, which we have to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about myths before we explore some of the myths regarding Darwin that you talk about in the book, because you also talk about myths themselves in the book. So first of all, what is a myth and what roles do myths play?
Myths are not just simple falsehoods, and that's why in the subtitle of the book I make the distinction between debunking myths and correcting falsehoods. Falsehoods are inaccurate statements about history, which are probably easy to correct, but myths are more than that. And as the late John Heilbron explains in this magnificent first chapter that he kindly accepted to write, myths usually serve a role, a specific role in the specific social context in which they're conceived. And that's why they're not always bad. There are myths that sometimes are useful. Of course, there are myths that are sometimes dangerous, but they are there in some sense in a deliberate way. They're not just accidents of history or falsehoods that nobody cared to correct. These exist, but myths are more than that.
Mhm. And in the book, you talk about an interesting distinction that Kostas Gavroglu, I hope I'm pronouncing the name
Yep,
correctly,
yep.
has made among three different kinds of myths: anodyne myths, dangerous myths, and historiographical myths. Could
Yeah.
you tell us about that?
Yeah, historian Kostas Gavroglu made this distinction, which I found very useful. And as you see, I cite a book in Greek that he wrote. And the key issue here is that we have myths that do not do any harm. For instance, whether Galileo dropped those balls from Pisa or the Pisa Tower or not, it doesn't change anything in how science is done. This is what he describes as anodyne myths, myths that do no harm. This is what the word means. But there are also dangerous myths, like the perpetual myth that science and religion are always in conflict, which masks the complicated interaction between scientists and their religious beliefs, scientists themselves and the church across time. This is a very strange, complicated, interesting relationship that is not clearly explained by the representation of the conflict. And we also have, in the end, as he argues, historiographical myths, which were created by historians in the past in their attempt to correct the first two kinds. For instance, that science is objective and is not affected by the cultural context, which of course is not true. All of us, all scientists, everyone works in a specific socio-cultural context, and there are always influences. So there are myths which are more or less important. There are myths that do more or less harm, but all these are more just falsehoods, and it is important to keep this in mind.
Mhm. So, of course, we will not have time to go through all of the myths regarding Darwin that you explore in the book. So, I just picked some of them that I think are good illustrations of what you explore there, both in regards to Darwin's work and character, but also a broader commentary on how science works and is done and how we should relate to scientists. So, first of all, were Darwin's ideas original to him? I mean, for instance, did people before Darwin really not think that species change was possible?
Yeah. Pietro Corsi explains in his chapter that the idea of evolution was in the air long before Darwin. It is also interesting that all the key notions that Darwin used, the analogy with artificial selection, the idea that Malthus had about the struggle for existence, and everything else were there. What was brilliant in Darwin is that he found a way to put these pieces of the puzzle together and propose a theory, the basis of which is still accepted today. The key idea that Darwin is descent with modification, with two important aspects: common descent on the one hand and natural selection on the other, which leads to divergence. So, what the brilliance of Darwin was through his deep reading and his own experimental work and observations to bring everything together in a quite coherent theory.
But more broadly, what does it mean for ideas to be original? I mean, does it matter who had the ideas first? And what does it mean exactly?
Well, there are some people who come up with original ideas, but when it comes to science, I don't think that it is the idea that is the only important aspect. It is also who manages to do something with this idea. For instance, propose a theory that explains or makes predictions. And this is the important stuff. So we do not really know who was the first to come up with the idea of evolution, but it was Darwin who, in 1859, published a book that presented a coherent theory. There were theories before that. For instance, Lamarck had proposed a theory many years before Darwin, but this was a quite speculative theory. It was not a theory as well constructed and as well documented as Darwin's. This being said, what Darwin managed to show was the potential of his theory to explain evolution, but he never managed to show that natural selection was actually competent in producing new species. Something that, of course, since then has been demonstrated in several different ways.
Mhm. So, of course, we know that we know it's true that some other person could have come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection instead of Darwin, because we have someone like Alfred Russell Wallace. But do you think that even other people in that particular historic and cultural context could have come up with the idea if Darwin never existed?
Absolutely. First of all, Darwin has been blamed by at least three authors that he stole the idea from some other people, one of them being Wallace. Wallace did not come up with the same theory as Michael Ruse explained in his chapter. It was a similar idea, but with a different basis. But historians have argued that it is not a coincidence that it was Wallace who lived in the same imperial social cultural context of England at the time, who came up with this idea, because it was the aspects of society that made him think in a similar way with Darwin. Nevertheless, Darwin had worked on that theory for a longer time, and as historians admit, he managed to establish it in a perhaps more coherent way than Wallace, who nevertheless thought in quite similar terms.
Mhm. And who were the people who influenced Darwin the most? Because I think it's also important for people to understand who's behind the ideas that then led Darwin to come up with his own ideas. So tell us
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. I think there are three major influences. The first one was his observation and work related to animal breeding. So he got engaged in breeder societies. He was able to see how breeders could do artificial selection in order to mate individual animals that they wanted and produce the features in the next generations that they wished. So that was one important aspect. And the big problem that Darwin had to deal with was, okay, but who's making this selection? In artificial selection with breeding, in the context of breeding, it was humans who made that selection. But what happens in nature? And then when he read the book by Thomas Malthus that talked about the struggle of existence, an idea that was very common at the time in the social context in which Darwin lived, he thought that perhaps it was a struggle and the competition within and between species that was driving this selection. This was already a core element of the theory which Darwin had very well developed until 1839, but there was something missing. What was missing was how the divergence of species was possible, and it took him another almost 20 years until 1857 to come up with another principle which is important for his theory, the principle of divergence, that showed that wherever there was space in the ecosystems, there was an open niche, it could be occupied by individuals which would thus further diverge in adapting in their environments. And he started writing a big book that he would call Natural Selection, but it was the receipt of the letter by Wallace in 1858 that made him reconsider things and write an abstract of 500 pages almost, which was The Origin of Species. So it was all in all his readings and understanding of development with respect to the principle of divergence, Malthus's idea of the struggle for existence, and importantly, and that was a key difference with Wallace, the analogy with artificial selection that produced the core of his theory.
So we have to, of course, talk about his historic visit to the Galápagos Islands, because everyone talks about that. I mean, it's one of the most famous aspects, events, if you want to call it that, of Darwin's life. And I mean, there's this common idea that what he was exposed to there was enough to convert him to evolutionary theory. I mean, is that true? And what did he gain intellectually from this visit?
Mm-hmm. No, it's not true, and that's an interesting myth because the visit to the Galapagos is usually presented as a eureka moment. Darwin suddenly saw the finches and came up with this brilliant idea, but the truth is that Darwin had no clue what was happening when he visited there. It was only later, upon his return to England, that ornithologist John Gould managed to understand the connections between the different specimens that Darwin had brought with him or sent back to England during his trips. And even after that, it doesn't seem that the finches were that important, because even though they have a prominent place in his book about the Beagle voyage, they're not even mentioned in The Origin of Species. So they're not that important for the theory, and it seems it was other organisms in the Galapagos which were more important. So this is not perhaps something, a myth that is that dangerous, but it is misleading because we tend to present an individual with a sudden observation and a sudden insight that goes up to bring a theory. But of course, the real story is more complicated than that.
So you mentioned the finches. What about them? I mean, what insights did he really get from them?
Once Darwin understood the connection, he realized that they were different but related species that had evolved from perhaps a single individual, which was something that was new at the time. There were many people who believed in special creation. Darwin, of course, was wondering why he could not see the same species inhabiting similar environments, which would make sense from the perspective of special creation. If a divine entity, if God had created species, it would be something to expect that they would be created in order to fit, to be adapted in the specific conditions. But he realized that in different volcanic islands, Galapagos and elsewhere, there were different species living, and it only made sense to explain this by thinking that, well, it's not a special creation, it has to do with individuals migrating from nearby continents that diversified and diverged to produce the species that were there. So when he realized what the available evidence was, it made sense to explain this as the outcome of a migration from the American continent and what we call today adaptive radiation of the different species on the different islands.
So there's this myth that Darwin was a sort of armchair theoretician, that, I mean, he came up with these ideas, these theories, basically by sitting for very long periods of time, thinking very hardly about whatever he was thinking about to come up with his ideas. So I mean, is that really the case?
Well, it's an interesting story because, he traveled around the world for 5 years and then moved to London, got married, and once they moved south of London to Down House, he practically never left the place. Instead, for some, some therapies or short trips, he was not working to earn his living. He did not give public lectures. He did not appear that much in the scientific meetings of the time. So that, of course, shows that he was a bit distant from the social activities of science, but he had an enormous number of correspondents all over the world, and he also did experimental work himself and observations in his house. So he was not an armchair theoretician, he was a practical experimentalist. He was a scientist who was doing real scientific work. It is just that he was a bit disconnected physically. He did not appear in person in meetings, but as I said, he had a huge number of correspondents with whom he exchanged views, whom sent him samples or anything he wanted. So he was quite active in real scientific work, nothing to do with just thinking and developing theories without any practical part.
And he also bred pigeons, right? So that's another example that illustrates why and how he wasn't just simply a theoretician. Right?
Yeah, he did interesting work. He was trying to see, for instance, whether the seeds of plants can survive in salted water in order to explain whether seeds could be transferred through sea from, the continent to islands. He did all different kinds of experimental work, which was very interesting.
And I mean, even for scientists in general, is being an armchair thinker really the way by which scientists usually come up with ideas? Because there's this very common idea that, I mean, there are certain individuals who have very high cognitive capacity that if they just sit on some ideas for long enough, then they can come up with big big revolutionary theories. But is that really how science tends to work?
Not at all, even though I should say that today, with all this data available on our computers, I know scientists who can, compile DNA data from different databases and do computational analysis. But even that is not really armchair thinking. It is work, real scientific work, but it's not done always in the lab, it's done on the computer. And nevertheless, even if today we have different means of interaction, mostly the internet that was not available in Darwin's time, we cannot really describe scientists as armchair thinkers because they need to have data and they need to explain what they see in ways that are in agreement with this data.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about Lamarck. I mean, how did Darwin react to Lamarck's ideas, at least on the first instance? I mean, did he really reject them outright?
Well, Darwin, it seems that he did not like the very speculative aspect of Lamarck's theory. He was exposed to it when he was very young in Edinburgh, working with Grant there, and he was also aware of the theory, the speculations of his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Now, in his writing, he has at several occasions tried to distance himself from Lamarck's nonsense, he wrote once. But if you look at his theory, in some sense, he's more Lamarckian than Lamarck himself, in the sense of how important the idea of use and disuse was for the production of variation in his own theory. So whereas publicly he has distanced himself from Lamarck, he practically accepted not the exact mechanism that Lamarck proposed, but a very similar idea where use and disuse was important for the production of variation.
In regards to his theories, can we reduce Darwin's theories to natural selection? And was his main theory completed after he arrived at that idea?
No, and that's another important myth that Darwin came up with a theory, as I said, in March 1839. He had natural selection, that is all. No, natural selection, of course, is an important aspect of his theory, but there are other important ones. The most important two being the idea of common descent, which was not widely accepted at the time, and the principle of divergence, which was key for how natural selection works. So natural selection is indeed one important part of his theory, but it's not that his whole theory can be reduced to that.
Right. So you've already mentioned these briefly in earlier in our conversation, but were Darwin's and Alfred Russell Wallace's theories the same?
No, they were not the same. There was essentially a process like natural selection described in both, but there were important differences throughout the years. The most important one being the analogy with artificial selection. For Darwin, this was key. For Wallace, it was wrong. And that's why at some point he suggested Darwin to replace the concept of natural selection with the concept of the survival of the fittest, which had been coined by Herbert Spencer. For Wallace, the idea that there's selection done by someone or somehow was misleading in how natural selection, in how the process takes place. And so the analogy with artificial selection was a big, big difference between the two views. It was central for Darwin, it was practically wrong for Wallace.
So there is also this very common idea that once Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection and published On the Origin of Species and then his other books, but particularly The Origin of Species, he basically won the argument, won the debate immediately. But were there opponents of Darwin's that had good scientific arguments?
Absolutely. It is interesting that there are two reviews appearing a few months after the publication of The Origin of Species, both anonymous, which have the very same argument that natural selection had never been shown at the time to be actually competent to produce new species. And this argument was made both in the review by Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, and by Thomas Henry Huxley, which was one of Darwin's most ardent supporters. Both of them acknowledged and made a scientific argument saying that, look, natural selection as proposed by Darwin might, in principle, explain the emergence of new species, but where is an actual example? There was no actual example at the time. And Darwin never managed to provide one.
Mm-hmm. So people attribute very commonly the phrase survival of the fittest to Darwin. But where does it really come from?
Yeah, as I said, that was an idea, a concept coined by Herbert Spencer. And Darwin was gradually convinced to replace that in subsequent, to use that to replace natural selection in subsequent editions of The Origin. And the reason was that, and it is true, natural selection is a bad metaphor because there's this implicit idea that someone does the selection. But interestingly, survival of the fittest is even worse because it is an eliminative view of selection, whereas natural selection allows for variations to coexist, and this gives material to evolution. The idea of survival of the fittest is not creative selection, it's eliminative selection that takes out all but one, and this actually limits the potential for further evolution. So both metaphors have problems, and neither natural selection, neither survival of the fittest was ideal, but natural selection eventually was closer to Darwin's own views.
Mm-hmm. So, did Darwin undermine essentialism? Because we also hear very commonly that once he came up and published about his theory of evolution by natural selection, then I mean, sometimes people talk about biological essentialism, other times just specifically about species essentialism. That was completely undermined by his theory. I mean, but did he really undermine essentialism? And if so, what kind of essentialism exactly?
Yeah. It was a kind of typological essentialism that Darwin had to deal with. It was certainly not Aristotelian essentialism. That was the problem. And the big issue here, notwithstanding the details, was that the myth, and this is perhaps a bit implicit in the chapter, what annoys me in this story is that we have a big figure of science, Aristotle, and another big figure, Darwin, and the second shows that the first was wrong. Of course, the story is never as simple as that, and it's never about individual figures, no matter how important their contributions were. There is this intuitive notion that, in scientific revolutions, we had 2,000 years of Aristotelian biology, and then Darwin suddenly came and destroyed everything and changed everything. It was neither the one nor the other. It was always a complicated story. What is true is that people tended not to realize the extent of variation that is available in nature, not even Darwin himself before he did his famous study with the barnacles. And so what Darwin brought in, which was new and important, was that he documented that there was a lot of variation available in nature, and therefore it was possible for selection to take place. And he also noted that, the limits between species are not always that clear. It's not, even today we know that it's not simple to delimit species. So we have this intuitive notion, essentialism, that we still use to do taxonomy and classification, because we have to define some essential properties, but still it is not as clear-cut as we think it to be. At the time, essentialism was more accepted because under the notion of spatial creation, we could think that species are created and therefore are clearly delimited. Darwin realized that they were not clearly delimited, and this brought in the idea that perhaps they're not created, but have evolved from one another.
So let me ask you now about his 1871 prediction of African human origins, about how humans originated in Africa. What did he claim exactly?
Well, that was not really a scientific prediction. It was just a speculation that because humans and apes are quite similar, and because apes are mostly found in Africa, therefore it makes sense to think that humans may have originated in Africa, which in the end was shown to be the case, but it was not really a consistent and coherent scientific prediction. It was just a speculation that ended up being correct because of the similarities that were evident. What was important is that Darwin accepted that apes could be our relatives, which was not something that other people found easy to accept.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit now about scientific revolution. So was Darwin's theory revolutionary, at least in the life sciences?
Well, it was not exactly revolutionary in the Kuhnian sense that there was a paradigm that was very different, and Darwin brought something that was entirely new. But what Darwin managed to establish was first the idea of common descent, which he documented very well in his book, and second, the process by which divergence diversification is possible. So what was revolutionary in Darwin was that he managed to bring together many different elements that produced a quite coherent theory. And as I said, even today, after so many years, the main premise, descent with modification, is something that we still accept. Of course, the details have changed, the theory has advanced, but what was revolutionary in some sense in Darwin is that he managed to establish a coherent theory which we use still today.
And at least in a Kuhnian sense, what makes for a scientific revolution? I mean, what is a scientific revolution exactly?
In the Kuhnian sense, you have to have two paradigms that are very different, incommensurable is the term that Kuhn used. They're totally different from each other. And the new one has to entirely replace the previous one. But if you look at the theories accepted before and after, first of all, there were many different theories before Darwin, and there were many different theories after Darwin. Darwinism, as we call it today, itself was not accepted immediately. It took years for it to be widely accepted. It was well in the 20th century that it became the mainstream theory. So it was never the case that we had the complete replacement of one theory by another. We had many theories before, many theories after. It was just that Darwinism was the most solid one. And that's why, again, we accept today its main premises. Not all the details, because many of the details were wrong, obviously.
Mm-hmm. So just a minute ago, you mentioned that the theory of evolution by natural selection over time has changed, of course, and there's been the introduction of new ideas and new data provided us with a better understanding of how evolution actually works. And even more recently, we have proposals like the extended evolutionary synthesis and things like that. So, I mean, I wanted to ask you, I don't think that you talk exactly about this in the book, but is sort of related to the ideas you explore there. I mean, many times when we talk about Darwin, people sort of put him on a pedestal, and if someone questions some of his ideas and provides novel data and information and says that Darwin was wrong in this or that aspect, sometimes people have a very negative and even emotional reaction to that, as if Darwin, just because he came up with the theory originally, I guess we can say, that we can't really question him. That Darwin is basically someone we can't question when it comes to natural selection and evolutionary biology more generally. But that's not really how we should treat scientists and their ideas.
Exactly. Well, for some people, Darwinism is a kind of secular religion, and they do not accept any criticism on Darwin. But Darwin was wrong on many things, as all scientists have been wrong on many things. Actually, most scientists have been wrong on most of the things that they have said, but it is just that some of them ended up being correct, accurate, and work. But it is normal in science not to be able to find all the answers immediately, in some cases never. And then, of course, it is always a collaborative endeavor. There are groups that work and cross time. And this is why, as you said, evolutionary theory itself has evolved. We had the merging with genetics in the beginning of the 20th century. We have the merging with development and genomics and all this recent stuff, and epigenetics more recently. The theory becomes richer with a greater potential to explain, and this is how science works. Theories evolve. Darwin, I repeat once again, put a solid basis, descent with modification. That's what we still accept, but he was wrong about many things, and that's normal. He could not have known what we know today, but he put us, the scientists doing research, in a path that was very fruitful, and this is why we still accept the theory.
Mm-hmm. So let me just ask you about one last topic then, and it is just a sort of conclusion to all of what we've been talking about. So tell us about the main things we can learn about science as a human activity by tackling myths like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, hero worshipping is a big problem, as we have already discussed. And it is important to know that science is not done by male white individuals who are more brilliant than other people. It is done by humans who work in groups and who collectively together produce what we accept as knowledge. And this is why it is the consensus of experts that matters. It is not what Darwin, Mendel, any individual ever said. What we call today scientific knowledge is what was accepted as the consensus by experts. Now, as I write in the conclusion, at Darwin's time, the position of women, not only in science, is society more broadly, it was much worse than it is today. I hope that today we're doing better in that sense. People should be judged not by their gender or anything else. They should be judged by their intellectual contributions when it comes to science. But as I show, Darwin, even though he did not think that women were as capable intellectually as men, he did help many of them when he realized that there was something in what they had to contribute. And I think this is very important. No matter his prejudices, and there were many prejudices at the time, he did help some women to advance and produce the kind of work they wanted to do. So all in all, we need to think of science as a collective endeavor done by many people. And what is important is to realize that it is the view of experts, the consensus of the expert communities that is important, not what any single individual, no matter how influential she is, has to say.
Mm-hmm. And we also have to take into account, I guess, the influence of the historical, social, cultural, and even scientific milieu of the particular individuals. I mean, where they lived in, the sort of broader context they inhabited.
Absolutely. I mean, Darwin was working in the tradition of natural theology, for which adaptation was crucial. And this is why, by reading Paley, he became interested in the question of adaptation. And then he had the political economists of the time, Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. They were both important influences on him. And then he traveled all over the world thanks to the British ships, and he sent back his material. So all in all, he worked in a context that facilitated what he was doing. It would not have been perhaps that easy for anyone else anywhere else in the world. And that's why, as I said, it's not a coincidence perhaps that Wallace, who worked and lived in the same context, came up with the same idea.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that it's not just the ways that the context can facilitate the production of particular ideas or coming up with particular ideas, but also how it can limit the individual when it comes to his or her biases and limitations when it comes to producing science. Because, for example, certain kind of scientific information or data might not be there yet, and they also might be influenced by their social milieu, as Darwin was when it comes to his ideas about women, for example. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why the community matters, because it is the community that will serve as a filter to filter out what each individual says, and the community together will decide which view makes more sense or not. That's why individuals have their own biases, but when the community comes together, these biases can be discussed, filtered, and we end up with the most plausible theory possible.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is again Darwin Mythology, Debunking Myths, Correcting Falsehoods. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview, and I'm also leaving a link to our first interview. So, Dr. Kampourakis, just before we go, apart from the book, where can people find your work on the internet?
Well, I have a personal website, Kampourakis.com, where all my work is available, both books and articles, and much of it is accessible. Of course, anybody is welcome to contact me and ask for any material possible.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
It's a pleasure for me too. Thank you for the invitation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanous, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.